Hi there guys, this is Miss Estes again, and today we're going to take a look at word problems where we're going to be adding and subtracting fractions. So our I can statement for today is I can solve word problems involving addition and subtraction of fractions, referring to the same whole, including cases of unlike denominators. Because in 5th grade, most of the problems we're dealing with do have those unlike denominators. So the first thing I want to do is to review those steps that we have to go through in order to add and subtract fractions with unlike denominators. So if you look on the screen, our first step is to list the multiples of your denominators in order to find the least common multiple, or the LCM, which is sometimes known as the LCD, or the least common denominator. Both of those are talking about the same thing. So once you know your common multiple or your common denominator, then you're going to make equivalent fractions using that least common multiple as your new denominator. Once you've made your equivalent fractions, then all you have to do is add or subtract your fractions. And then your fourth step is to simplify or reduce the answer if possible. So if we take a look at this first word problem, at a party, Andy and April shared a cherry pie. Andy ate 2/5 of the pie, and April ate 1/3 of the pie. What fraction of the pie did they eat altogether? So the first thing we need to think about is, what is it that they are asking? They're wanting to know what fraction of the pie did they eat altogether? And when we see that word altogether, what does that signal that we need to do? Yes, that means that we are going to need to add these two fractions together. So Andy ate 2/5 of the pie, and then April ate 1/3 of the pie. And once we add that together, we'll be able to find how much they ate altogether. So our first step is we need to find a common denominator because they do not have the same denominator. So we have our denominator 5 and a denominator of 3. So our denominators of 5, our multiples of 5, 5, 10, 15, 20, 25. I'm going to go ahead and stop there. We can always add more multiples if we need to. Our multiples of 3, 3, 6, 9, 12, 15. And we're going to stop there because we see that they have the common multiple of 15. So that means 15 is going to be our common denominator. So now we need to make equivalent fractions with 15 as that denominator. So if we take a look at the denominators, 5 times 3 is 15. So we're going to do the same thing to our numerator and multiply 2 times 3 to equal 6. And then if we look at our second denominator, 3 times 5 is 15. So we're going to do the same thing to our numerator and multiply 1 times 5, which equals 5. So now that we've made our equivalent fractions, we have two fractions with the same denominator, so we're dealing with same size parts, and we can add these two together. So we look at our numerators first. 6 plus 5 is 11, and then our denominator stays 15. And before we say for sure this is our final answer, we want to look at this fraction 11/15 and see if it can be reduced. Well, I know that 11 is a prime number, which means it only has two factors, and that is 1 and itself. And 11 will not divide into 15 evenly. So that means this fraction is already simplified. So when we go back to our question, what fraction of the pie did they eat altogether? We could say that they ate 11/15 of the pie. And then when we come up here and write our equation, we can write 6/15 because this is what we use to solve this problem. 6/15 plus 5/15 equals 11/15. And there's our equation. All right. So if we look at our second problem here, when Leslie arrived at the party, a whole pumpkin pie was left. So that's important. I'm going to underline that. If Leslie ate 2/5 of the pie, then how much was left? So we're trying to figure out how much was left. Since we're trying to figure out how much was left, that's a clue that we're going to need to do what operation? Subtraction, that's correct. So, but when I look back at the problem, I only see one fraction. But I did underline this important information, a whole pumpkin pie. So we're taking one whole and then we are subtracting the 2/5 from that because that's how much Leslie ate. I want to take this one whole though, and I want to write it as a fraction so that way it'll be easier to subtract my two fractions. One whole is equal to what fraction? If 5 is my denominator here, then I want to use that for my denominator for my whole number. So one whole would be 5/5. And then I can subtract 2/5. So we have two fractions with like denominators, so subtracting is going to be pretty easy. So if we look at our numerators, 5 minus 2 is 3, and our denominator is going to stay the same. So for our solution, the question is how much was left? We know that 3/5 of the pie was left over. So we just have to be very careful when we're dealing with these subtraction problems. If they're talking about, you know, one whole of something, here it's talking about the whole pumpkin pie. It might be talking about the whole class or the whole piece of paper. We need to think about what fraction would be equal to one whole, depending on whatever denominator we're using in the problem. So for our equation, we use 5/5 minus 2/5 to get 3/5. So there's our equation. So the last thing I want us to look at is we must remember to read each question carefully and think about what the question is asking. A lot of times when we do add and subtract, luckily there are clue words that we can look for to help us make sure that we are adding or subtracting. So if we look at addition, some of our clue words, and there might be others, but these are some of the most common ones. We know that if we see the word add, altogether, which is what we saw in our example problem, and, both, in all, some, definitely some, because that means that is the answer to an addition problem, the total of something, or increase. If it's increasing, we're combining, we're adding together. And then our clue words for subtraction, if we're finding the difference, because that is the answer to a subtraction problem. If we're talking about how many fewer, if somebody gave away something, or if they're taking away something, that means they're removing, and so we're going to come up with a smaller answer. How many more, how much longer, how much shorter, how much smaller. If we're trying to figure out how much is left, like we were trying to do in the pie question. Less, change, anytime we're trying to find out how much change someone has left, if it's a money problem, we have to subtract. And then if we decrease, so anytime we are decreasing, we are subtracting. So that's going to be the most important thing when we're dealing with the word problems. Because once we know if we need to add or subtract, then we can follow our steps of finding the common denominator by listing our multiples, making those equivalent fractions, and then adding or subtracting depending on what the problem is asking us to do. So just always make sure that you go back to that question, go back to that problem, read that question carefully to make sure you know exactly what operation you should be doing. Easy as that, guys. Good job.